Welcome you all to Mansfield College and to the Being Human, Being a Person conference. Our presenters today will be sharing their research on contemporary perspectives in philosophical and theological anthropology. My name is Ashley Moyse. I'm the MacDonald Postdoctoral Fellow in Christian Ethics and Public Life at Christ Church, and I'll be helping to manage today. Before I introduce our first speaker, let me give a word of thanks to the British Academy as well as to the Issachar Foundation. Their generous support has allowed us to arrange the conference today. Thanks also to the assistance and collaboration of the MacDonald Centre, where I'm housed, as well as the Oxford Centre for Theology and Modern European Thought. A note of housekeeping. If you have a cell phone with you or a laptop, if you can make sure that the sound is turned to off, that would be wonderful. We are recording today, and so we want the ambiance to be suitable for those recordings. If there is an emergency, we have an exit in the back, and we have an exit over here. The toilet is through these doors on the main level. If you need a drink of water during the session, you can also find your way to the foyer and find water there. We have a couple of breaks scheduled today in which we'll enjoy some coffee or tea together. Lunch will be, you have to fend for yourself for lunch. The lectures will be recorded, as I said, and published or posted at this website, christianflourishing.com. And this website corresponds to another project that Professor Jens Zimmermann is leading along with Professor Michael Burdett. This is a project that involves a wide range of scholars around the world. It's a project working toward a comprehensive vision for human flourishing in a world of technology. Finally, let me introduce our first speaker. Time is short. Professor Jens Zimmermann is a Canada Research Professor for Interpretation, Religion, and Culture at Trinity Western University, as well as the Visiting Professor for Philosophy, Literature, and Theology at Regent College. Both institutions are in the Greater Vancouver area in Canada. He's also a Visiting Fellow of the British Academy at the University of Oxford, and Research Associate at the Centre for Theology and Modern European Thought, also here. So thank you. Jens?
Thank you, Ashley. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our symposium. So I'll jump right in to my sort of initial, slightly general talk on this topic. The reason I want to talk to you about personhood this morning is because of my conviction that the notion of person captures the robust understanding of what it means to be a human, and that we will need that kind of understanding to address intelligently the challenges arising from the technological and biotechnological advances of our time. Now, as you likely all know, transhumanism is the idea that we can custom design human evolution and engineer a synthetic version of ourselves by merging human consciousness and artificial intelligence. This idea is only the extreme edge, I think, of a general tendency in our culture to reduce human nature to something impersonal, to something other than what it should be. And I will argue in this lecture that transhumanism, along with more generally reductive views of what it means to be human, are based on the refusal to acknowledge the exceptional status of human beings as person. Now, basically, going to do that in three brief parts. So first, I want to sketch out what I call sort of a post-Cartesian landscape to lay out the terrain for present considerations about human nature. And then in a second and a little bit the longer part of the lecture, delineate a robust definition of personhood as self-transcendent, relational, and embodied consciousness, which I think is characteristic of our humanity and cannot be separated from human nature or thinking about the human species. And then third, I will just end with a quick final word or two on the kind of danger I think that transhumanism as a movement, as it were, poses to our self-understanding. So first, what do I mean by the post-Cartesian landscape? I think it is indeed in part because of transhumanism and its push to digitize and upload consciousness to computing platforms that present discussions about human nature are closely linked to philosophies of mind and the nature of consciousness. The context of this discussion is this post-Cartesian landscape because for over a decade now, many philosophers and evolutionary psychologists and other cognitive scientists are rejecting Cartesian dualism in favor of a more integrated view of mind and body. And they do this usually based on some kind of monism or philosophical monism. At least there's a tendency, I think, toward that. And those of you familiar with continental philosophy will know, of course, that Cartesian dualism had been thoroughly criticized and arguably buried since the 1920s by thinkers such as the later Husserl, Max Scheler, Martin Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and also I'm thinking here of Hans Jonas and the seminal book, The Phenomenon of Life. However, neither Google engineers nor cognitive scientists are, as a rule, well acquainted with these philosophical critiques of Descartes, and present discussions about our humanity are therefore still laboring under the impact of this Cartesian ontological dualism. Now, Descartes was right, I think, to recognize the self-transcendence and primordial existence of human reason, of consciousness, but he was wrong to sever the mind from the body for the sake of his foundationalist project. This division not only reduced the living body to an inert conductor of sense impressions, but also established a disembodied representational view of cognition. According to this model of perception, the mind registers information from an assembly of objects out there, from a world machine that, just like our body machine, can be broken down into information bits, into context-free atomized bits and propositions that are then transmitted as verifiable symbolic representations to the inner mind. And when we add Galileo's mathematization of nature to this representational worldview, we complete the ideal of the modern truth-seeking mind, a calculating, verifying machine that seeks truth by breaking reality down into its most primitive components and devises algorithms to present formalized representations of reality through the information processing mind. Now, it was only a matter of time until Descartes' disembodied consciousness became swallowed up by the verificationist scientific worldview it helped to establish. The Cartesian mind, the ghost in the machine, shared the fate of the body and became materialized and mechanized. An important catalyst for this development was evolutionary theory, that is, the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature that's still somewhat prevalent among today's cognitive and brain sciences. Now, I think evolutionary theory itself is very helpful because it reintegrates consciousness into the biological life of the body. But Neo-Darwinians are committed to reductive materialism or physicalism. And for physicalists, as you know, undeterred by lack of evidence, the emergence of mind must be reducible to the laws of physics and chemistry, because otherwise the totalizing reach of empirical science's explanatory power would be in doubt. As Thomas Nagel has shown in his book Mind and Cosmos, physicalists combine this dogmatic commitment to materialism with a stubborn refusal of examining the metaphysical assumptions behind it. This combination of naturalistic dogma and philosophical carelessness explains why in transhumanism, evolutionary theory and the machine mind with its representational model of perception remain the orthodox view of human consciousness. While purporting to rely on empirical science that reduced the mind to a byproduct of evolution, transhumanism still operates on a mind-body dualism and a cognitivist model of perception. And the best sort of popular model for this cognitivism that I found is this following brief scene from the Terminator 2 movie, which depicts the computational perception of a machine brain as the quantifiable scientific breakdown of each person this machine encounters. You may remember this. So, I mean, this is a nice illustration of that model. Current AI research, of course, has moved to a more complete, or complex model, I should say, of the brain, with neural networks possessing learning capabilities. But these networks still remain disembodied, and AI research remains committed to formalism. That is, AI rests on the illusion that human perception and agency are reducible to formalized rules. Likewise, cognitive science still remains under the gravitational pull of the Cartesian mind. Cognitive scientists reject the transhumanist agenda of digitalizing the brain, and they insist on the need for a biological substratum for thought. But neuroscience also reconnects the mind only to a small part of the body, namely the brain, and it's only recently that neuroscientists have argued for the impact of other body parts on cognition, on thought and how we think. On the whole, cognitive science, it seems to me, stays addicted to brainhood rather than a truly corporeal self, and its metaphysic remains naturalistic. Now, to complete our sketch here of the post-Cartesian landscape, we also need to talk about post-humanism, another monism on human nature. Post-humanism reject Cartesian dualism with a vengeance, and they also refuse the neo-Gnostic tech hype of the transhumanists. They suggest instead a non-reductive materialist monism of self-organizing information or self-organizing matter. For post-humanists, human exceptionalism is the original sin that causes all our troubles. Capitalism, patriarchal oppression, exploitation of animals, and environmental meltdown all stem from a misconception that the human consciousness occupies a special place in nature. The solution? In dissolving all consciousness into a monistic vitalism of self-organizing matter, we also dissolve the pesky exceptional human subject. And by erasing differences between animals, humans, and intelligent machines, by deconstructing biological binaries, we usher in world peace, as it were. Some post-humanists, like Rosi Braidotti, realize that a crucial problem with the impersonal monistic metaphysic is the lack of self-transcendence for critical distance from and resistance to the interconnected matrix of the great one self-organizing matter thing. Post-humanism have to wrestle with the fact that deconstructing human exceptionalism also abolishes the personalist anthropology that grounds ethics as responsibility, and responsibility toward nature and so on is what they want. Now, the reason for mapping this post-Cartesian landscape for you was to set up my argument that these options are insufficient attempts to overcome the pull of Cartesian dualism. As long as the cognitive sciences and post-human philosophies operate with these reductive anthropologies that neglect the exceptional wonder of the person, we remain, I think, ill-equipped to meet the challenges arising from the technological world. Responsible use of technology will come not from reducing ourselves to highly complex biological machines and their digital transhumanist versions, but from recognizing, preserving, and cultivating the exceptional qualities of human personal consciousness. To ensure a truly human future, we need a personalist anthropology that defines human consciousness as transcendent, embodied, and as a social unity. So with that, let's then go to the second part on personhood. And I define, as you've heard for the purpose of this lecture, a person as the psychosomatic unity that is self-transcendent, embodied, and relational consciousness. Now, the modern concept of the person has, as you know, a long history that stretches from Trinitarian and Christological discussions in antiquity and medieval times to the inviolable human dignity of persons that grounds our modern idea of human rights enshrined in seminal public documents like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the German Constitution, or the statutes of the European Bioethics Council, for instance. And the confluence of human dignity, identity, and rights in the concept of the person demonstrates the importance of our topic for a number of pressing contemporary issues. You could think of constitutional debates concerning the source of human dignity and rights, for bioethics, for discussions about dying with dignity, euthanasia versus palliative care, and also for environmental concerns, of course. The uniqueness of human beings and their right or task to cultivate nature and so on. Now, obviously, we can't do the whole history of personhood here, and I'm not intending to, but I do want to highlight a couple of peculiarities in this history namely religion and exceptionalism. And then we will focus on three defining constitutive aspects of personhood that I've already mentioned: self-transcendence, or freedom, sociality, and embodiment. Now, the first interesting thing about looking at the concept of personhood is that you can't tell the story of this concept without looking at religion, the cultural influence of religion, and in particular the cultural influence of Judaism and Christianity. Already in the Old Testament introduced into the ancient world the novel thought of a personal, sovereign, and radically transcendent creator God whose call conferred personal dignity and responsibility on individuals, a dignity that relativized political, tribal, and national allegiances. To the Hebrew mind, at least, God's image is not primarily associated with rationality, but with personal and communal responsibility. It is hard for us moderns to comprehend the radically novel personalizing power in God's calling of Abraham or Moses and their response, "Here I am." One of the most important ethical philosophers of the 20th century, Emmanuel Levinas, understood this innovative power when he used this call and response, "Here I am," as a shorthand for the ethical demand he believed to be definitive of all personal human relations. Now, the Christian belief in the Incarnation further enhanced this concept of personal human dignity, the teaching that God actually became a human being, entering into suffering and death in order to renew creation, decisively shaped the way we use the term person in our modern sense. The terms prosopon, persona, and dignitas had hitherto denoted mostly a person's social function or public role. It was through the influence of these Christian discussions, by defining God as one and three hypostases, a prosopoi, a personae, and later describing Jesus' divine and human natures united in one person, that the word person gained the interior depth and ethical weight we accord to it today. Oh, I had a bit here where I was going to interact with John Baer, but I'll leave that out because I know what he's thinking. So the second peculiar feature I want to mention, beside religion, that is part of this personhood story, is that the term is inseparable from human exceptionalism, no doubt in part on account of the religious influence we just mentioned. The Judeo-Christian version of this exceptionalism, human beings made in the image of a radically transcendent creator God, portrays humanity as vice regents with God over creation, in making human beings, as Psalm 8 puts it, a little lower than the angels. God, as Psalm goes on, crowned them with glory and honor, subjecting all things under their feet. This dominion language has drawn the ire of historians like Lynn White, who detects in the Judeo-Christian creation account a dualism of man and nature that sanctions then the exploitation of nature. White is wrong, however, in concluding that biblical exceptionalism expressed by the Imago Dei necessitates, I'm sure we've done this, but it doesn't necessitate either an ontological dualism or environmental exploitation. After all, New Testament writers and many early Christians after them interpreted human identity in light of the Incarnation to argue that in Jesus, human identity and vocation are unveiled as philanthropic priesthood over creation. Jesus defined dominion over creation as God's image by caring and suffering for the world to the point of death in order to ensure the flourishing of creation. And thus, contrary to what many environmental critics and post-humanists would have you believe, human exceptionalism need not be equivalent to the oppression of others and exploitation of nature. Rather, Christological interpretation of the image can define the human vocation as responsibility for others and the environment, a sense of accountability that I think eludes monistic worldviews for the lack of transcendence. Equally important, the Judeo-Christian emphasis on the body, especially in Chalcedonian Christology, ensured that personhood is inseparable from human nature. Separating this union usually results in ethical problems and confusion. Just to give you one example, you may recall that in the 1970s, the prominent Australian moral philosopher Peter Singer argued for a definition of the person as rational, self-aware being, on the basis of which he then introduced a novel distinction between a person and a human being. Human rights, including the right to life, he then proposed, should be extended only to the person as this rational being. Consistent with this logic, he concluded that an embryo or severely handicapped human who demonstrate no reasoning capacity are non-persons who may be killed, while animals who show reasoning capacity count as persons and should sooner enjoy the right to life and liberty and so on than non-rational humans. Now, Singer himself exemplifies the difficulty with separating the person from human nature by caring lovingly for his mother Cora, whose advanced condition back then of Alzheimer's rendered her a non-person according to his own definition. And when pushed on this issue, Singer admitted that the logical decision to end a non-rational human being's life becomes just a little bit different when it's your own mother. Why is it different, though? I think it is different because human love refuses to acknowledge the reduction of personhood to rational self-awareness, and consequently, love does not recognize the distinction between the human species and personhood. Love shows us that humanity, personhood, and responsibility are inseparable, and that another person imposes on us an ethical demand precisely through a living body, even in the absence of capabilities or rational lucidity. The person is an ensouled body, a psychosomatic unity, and Peter Singer's example, I think, demonstrates the importance of a proper definition of personhood for our time of unprecedented scientific and technological possibilities. It is therefore, to me, all the more astounding that very little of this discussion is going on among transhumanists. Now, the three key aspects of personhood that will be most helpful, I think, for exposing these reductive views are indeed self-transcendence, sociality, and embodiment. These three elements are what make us persons, and they shape our consciousness of self, others, and the world. And they're interrelated. You cannot really separate them out. I mean, you talk about them separately, but they belong together and qualify us as persons. Let's begin then with self-transcendence. As indicated earlier, the biblical account of creation reduced the view of human beings that broke away from the impersonal worldviews of a number of ancient pagan philosophies. Early Christian theologians, for example, believed that while human beings, like all other sentient organisms, were animated biologically by a soul, a psyche or anima, God also vivified them in a particular way with his own spirit, allowing them to transcend their biological instincts and drives towards a creative covenant partnership with God, to throw in a Barthian term. It has become commonplace to associate this freedom from nature, as did Peter Singer, with reason, with the self-awareness of a rational mind. Everything depends, however, on how you read or interpret the term rational, lest you fall into the same reductive view of consciousness that he advocated. So there's much more of a personal self-transcendence than mere self-awareness in this notion. Animals are certainly sentient, they're self-aware, they're able to reason out puzzles or problems in order to obtain goals, and yet I still think the freedom of animals from organic processes is nothing like the personal human freedom from nature. Human persons have a unique capacity for objectifying the world they participate in. Human consciousness is able to reflect on the difference of things for me and things in themselves. Unlike animals who are their nature, Homo sapiens are persons because they have their nature. That is, they're not bound by their nature, but they relate to it. Personal transcendence grants us the ability to adopt a view from nowhere, as it were, to observe ourselves, to distance ourselves from drive and from instincts. Martin Heidegger spoke in this context about the ecstasis of human existence, the rising above one's environment, whereby humans have a world rather than merely be part of it. The German, the sort of father of philosophical anthropology in Germany, Max Scheler, coined the memorable term world openness, Weltoffenheit, for this characteristically human self-transcendence. In his famous lecture, Humanity's Place in the Cosmos, Scheler argued that evolution accorded human beings an exceptional position, eine Sonderstellung, in the cosmos by developing world openness as the main distinctive of human identity. And Scheler observes that similar to humans, animals possess traits such as intelligence, tool-making, gifting, helpfulness, reconciliation, and all other kinds of even affective traits. What truly sets humans apart, however, he argued, is personhood, a unique type of consciousness characterized by mind or spirit. Of course, the German is Geist. And Geist is nothing mystical for him, but denotes primarily a uniquely human epistemic function, a way of perceiving things. And this function is to make possible objective knowledge of the world as world. According to Scheler, spirit or Geist connotes an existential freedom from organic instinctual life, that allows us to abstract things from their immediate concern for us and objectify them as objects of intrinsic interest. And so in that even while they depend on natural environments and biology, humans therefore possess the freedom to construct an objectified map of the world that liberates the mind from trial and error of immediate sense experience and allows orientation toward reality as a whole. Only human beings, he says, contemplate being as such and reflect abstractly on contingency by asking the question why there's something rather than nothing. For Scheele and other personalist philosophers, this distinctive of world openness has a number of important corollaries, which we can only touch on here quickly. But they're basically that we're language beings, historical beings, and truth beings in a particular way. So how are we linguistic beings and world open? Because of our world openness, human language is not merely instrumental. It's not a toolkit of words assigned or that assigns labels to objects so that we can get what we want. Words are not arbitrary, but arise from and shape our personal transcendent way of being in the world. Human language is not a representational system for information conveyance, but constitutes and mediates to us the relation of the world. Language is not only the medium in which by which we inhabit the world like fish live in water, but language is also the means by which we imagine the world differently. Especially poetical, mythological, and metaphorical language expresses the uniquely human way of being at home in a meaningful world and of reimagining the possibilities of our existence to think the world differently. To say it with Hölderlin and Heidegger, we dwell in the world primarily poetically. Something very few university administrators usually understand. Moreover, as Michael Polanyi has argued, only human beings possess the ability to provide abstract linguistic maps of their being in the world and pass their entire culture on through verbal and written communication. This ability to pass on symbolic maps of reality to future generations and to immerse ourselves in the minds of the past in order to shape our present is what we generally call tradition. Critically appropriating tradition to form our own views is the very basis of human education. And then secondly, we are self-transcendence that Scheele called world openness, that marks our human consciousness, gives us a sense of time that makes us historical beings. Neither animals and certainly not machines have a sense of history. They don't identify themselves in the world in past, present, and future states the way we do. Persons are historical beings because our very consciousness of being in the world is historically constituted. I refer you here to the hermeneutic theory of Gadamer and so on and so forth that have delineated that in a very detailed way. It's only us really who, because of our historicity, we fret about the possibility of non-existence existentially. It's only us who really contemplate death. It's only us who really take out life insurance or envision continuations of ourselves in some form of immortality. And then finally, on account of this world openness, we are truth beings. We are those who can think a world and ourselves as being in it. We're able to create a distance between ourselves as subjects and all content of our consciousness. And this global objectifying sense of things within the totality of our existence on which we can yet again reflect is what philosophers mean when they say that humans are truth-oriented beings. And as such, we can set what we consider to be true in light of the totality of meaning assignations that constitute our world above immediate satisfaction of physical needs. For human persons, well-being is not exclusively homeostatic. That is, we don't reduce well-being to the optimal functioning of our metabolism. Rather, we're able to find happiness in abstract beliefs and direct our actions by what we deem true without immediate reference to ourselves. In other words, we can delight in truth and forgo pleasure for the sake of truth. I've tried to tell my kids that, it's just not really seeming to work. This truth orientation is what makes human nature also malleable. Personal self-transcendence involves not just a freedom from nature, but also freedom for self-development. As Scheele put it, becoming human, Menschwerdung, is rising to this world openness by the power of Geist, by the power of the mind or spirit. The Jewish philosopher Abraham Heschel notes in this context that human beings are never finished, never immutable, always seeking a model to emulate and to follow. And the German thinker Johann Gottfried Herder already cautioned in the 18th century that world openness that makes us persons comes with the risk and task of achieving our humanity. I'm sure that Graham Ward will later on, when he speaks about human beings as a riddle, will deepen this greatly. The reminder here that self-transcendence implies responsibility brings us to our second aspect of sociality, namely personhood. Human world openness and sociality are interrelated, and this reciprocal relation is constitutive of personal existence. Persons, as the philosopher Robert Spemann explains, only exist in the plural. What Spemann means, of course, is that our self-consciousness as persons is only possible with reference to another person. Consciousness is intrinsically relational. My very identity as someone requires consciousness of someone else. We only know objectively who we are in being known by others. The other person establishes myself as another and also provides an objective limit to my own reflective egocentrism. The objectivity of our self-knowledge is based on this personal reciprocal I-thou relation. As Paul Ricoeur has famously stated, the most direct way to self-knowledge is therefore via the detour through the other. Human persons exist in the plural only because being known grounds and structures the world openness that makes us person. I know myself as part of another self-consciousness person's world, and I also know that she knows herself as part of mine. This interpersonal relation that constitutes our human reality plays itself out from birth when parents interact with a child as personal other. Once again, this is embodied. Indeed, for the personalist philosopher John McMurray, the mother-child relation exemplifies the personal mutuality that is for him the basic form of human existence. The most basic unit of personal existence is not the individual, but two persons in personal relation. According to McMurray, the unity of the person is not the I, but the you and I. This means that we are persons not by individual right, but in virtue of our relation to one another. And the sociality that then defines our personal transcendence requires a particular epistemic mode of interaction, of perceiving. Knowing another person requires not simply awareness, but as Hegel famously noted, Anerkennung, recognition. Recognizing another as person means to be aware of another's self-transcendent, world-open self, who also acknowledges my personhood. And of course, the highest form of recognizing and affirming another person in his or her embodied uniqueness is again love. Love is willing to recognize and uphold the other person even when her capabilities fail. So Singer is perfectly right to care for his mother because she's being known by him as the same person, even when she loses her mind. Understanding personhood as being known by another marks the difference between the idea of the person as has acquired particularly through the Judeo-Christian tradition since antiquity. The person is no longer merely a social role, nor even a psychological profile, but it is that someone whose identity over time and throughout changing roles is recognized by another. In his moving prison poem, Who Am I?, the Lutheran theologian Nazi resistor Bonhoeffer exemplifies just this understanding of personhood. Incarcerated and incriminated, torn from his upper bourgeois privileges and supportive family, Bonhoeffer becomes uncertain whether his identity lay in the proud, authoritative bearing natural to him that impressed even his prison guards, or in the coward that he tried to hide. His response illustrates the social self we've been talking about. He found solace in being known by God. As the famous ending lines of the poems go, they haunt me, these questions of mine, but you know me, O God, I am thine. Here we have a profound religious expression of personal identity. And Bonhoeffer's Cri de Coeur also reveals to us the intrinsic connection of personal transcendence with ethics. Because our identity depends on being known, our lives are intrinsically lives in response to others. As persons, we are by nature response-able and therefore accountable to others. In fact, I shall venture to claim that the intrinsic relation of personal sociality and ethics grounds morality in human exceptionalism of the person. We should expect, in other words, ethical sensibility only ultimately from human persons, not from animals, and certainly not from machines. We don't hold, for example, a bear accountable when it kills a hiker who comes between it and its food. We can program ethical rules into machines, but this rule-keeping is at best a computational legalism that is far removed from the accountability of persons in relation that characterizes truly human ethics. And just because, a lot of Christian congregation, particularly evangelicalists, like that sort of legalism doesn't mean it is necessarily the way to go. So to sum up our main point, personal self-transcendence is social and therefore ethical. Person exists as response and accountability to other persons. It is, of course, a long-standing theological tradition that for persons, freedom from nature entails freedom for self-transformation in responsibility to others. And just to give you an example here, Gregory of Nyssa, for instance, believes that this is the very basis for virtue. He says that the most eminent part of God's image in us is, I quote, the act that we are free from necessity and not in bondage to any natural power, but we have decision in our own power as we please. For virtue is a voluntary thing, subject to no dominion. That which is the result of compulsion and force cannot be virtue. Of course, the next question in light of transhumanism, if whether that is you can control by a pill or some molecular artistry, is still virtue. The goal of virtue is to become like God. As Gregory's brother Basil explains, you have become like God through kindness, through endurance of evil, through communion, through love for one another. So when the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, over 1,000 years later, describes the transcendent sacredness and freedom of human personhood as the grounds for ethics, he draws there from a deep theological well of anthropology. And finally, personhood and the importance of the body. I've left this crucial and often overlooked aspect of personhood for last. Prior to our modern times, the body was deemed to be an important element in our consciousness of ourselves, the world, and others. The neglect of the body in Western culture is often blamed on Plato and Platonic Christianity, but in this case at least, Nietzsche's snide comment that Christianity is but Platonism for the people is widely off the mark. Contrary to a common misperception of Christianity as denigrating the body, many early Christians held that the human spirit participated in the stuff of matter and the animality of other living beings, even if the spirit was irreducible to its animal nature. Again, to go to Gregory, for example, he writes that in creating human beings, God, I quote, blended the divine with the earthy, that by means of both he may be naturally and properly disposed to each enjoyment, enjoying God by means of his more divine nature and the good things of earth, by a sense that is akin to them. Human beings, Nyssa continues, are made of body, soul, and spirit. The body forms the living vegetative organism which is endowed with a sentient organizational awareness, that is, with the kind of soul that we share with animals. And finally, there's the intellectual part, the nous, mind or spirit, given only to human beings. For Gregory, body and intellect form an organic unity. He argues that nature has fitted the human body for exercise of this reason, granting us hands, thus freeing the mouth and tongue from the task of foraging or grazing, he says, to allow for a voice box and speech in the service of reason. So our bodies are shaped in a way that allow us to use that capacity. Gregory also demonstrates that our contemporary question whether mind is reducible to brain is an ancient one, because he's talking about that. He rejects the idea that the mind is reducible to brain matter, concluding that, I quote, the mind is not restricted to any part of the body, but is equally in touch with the whole. Gregory advanced an integral view of mind and body where the immaterial mind, he says, mingles with our material nature by the agency of the senses in some inexplicable way. So that while our physical nature prospers according to its own order, the mind is also operative through it. We should not be surprised at the valuation of a body among early Christian writers. After all, they were inspired by this thing called Incarnation, God's becoming human, rising bodily from the dead, granting, albeit in transformed fashion, the body an integral importance in the new creation. For Gregory, at least, the body was so clearly part of the personality of the soul, or the soul, that it left an imprint on the soul, the body, by which the transformed body and the soul could later find each other in the resurrection. In Gregory's words, I quote, the rope of our body will be braided by the soul. Each element and order will be woven again to its former accustomed place and will wrap around that which is familiar to it. Even more interesting is that the body for him is a unique expression of each person. So that merely making a new alien body from earth at the resurrection, he says, that would not be truly myself if it were not in all respects the same as myself. Unless the new body contains the history and the features unique to me, he concludes, it would constitute, I quote, another person. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, again, I think summarizes the traditional Christian anthropology of the person as ensouled body when he declares in his lecture on Genesis that an individual, I quote, does not have a body and does not have a soul, but he is body and soul. The human being in the beginning is really his body. And on account of this embodied personhood, Bonhoeffer can speak of the earth as our mother and of animals as our brothers and sisters. So it wasn't theologians, however, but philosophers that have done the heavy lifting for establishing personhood as embodied consciousness in the 20th century. Here, the seminal thinkers like Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Michael Polanyi have shown that the particular self-transcendence or world openness that structures human consciousness in terms of sociality, linguisticality, and temporality requires the living body as the irreplaceable substratum or medium for perception. Heidegger, the merit of his philosophy really quickly is just to have shown that perception and engagement of the world is preeminently practical rather than theoretical. For example, when we see a chair, our brains don't merely process a symbolic representation of the chair, but we perceive a chair intuitively as part of our total world of practical, embodied, everyday experience. For this reason, Heidegger defined understanding as knowing one's way around, sich auf etwas verstehen, as a kind of practical know-how or skillful coping that allows us to negotiate our everyday world successfully. The second thinker here, Polanyi, even more strongly emphasizes the physical, biological aspects of human knowing. Our body, says Polanyi, is the ultimate instrument of all our knowledge, whether intellectual or practical. In all our waking moments, we are relying on our awareness of contacts of our bodies with things outside for attending to these things. And so for Polanyi, this attendance from the body to the world is part of the tacit knowing that is shared by all sentient organisms. For the lowest of the highest life forms, he argues, living beings learn to negotiate the environment by integrating particulars of physical experience into a focal activity. Whether we contract eye muscles when squinting to discern something at a distance, or whether we drive a nail into the wall with a hammer, in each case we rely unreflectively on body parts, tools, or movements in order to focus on something we want to comprehend or accomplish. Tacit knowing, therefore, possesses a kind of forward movement of exploration in which an organism indwells what is known, brings to bear his knowledge focally on the environment in order to then master it. In evolution, this embodied knowing, says Polanyi, has allowed higher level of consciousness to emerge all the way up to the human mind with the uncanny ability to indwell not just bodies, but the ideas of other persons in order to receive and transmit intellectual heritage or human culture, as we've said. And then finally, Merleau-Ponty provides probably the strongest philosophical case for signification in the flesh. He describes the living body as an outward manifestation of a person's being in the world. He speaks here of the body's motor intentions, la motricité, to describe the knowledge of distance, movement, and placement we acquire through bodily habits, and thus in a sense affirming Heidegger's insight that to understand something is to know one's way around through embodied intention. These thinkers show conclusively, I think, that human subjectivity cannot be disembodied. To pick up our earlier phrase, human beings only have a world as inspirited bodies. Take, for example, the plurality of our person that we discussed earlier. We are someone because we are aware of being known by another person, but this awareness, of course, is embodied. And likewise, our perception of the world, as it is deposited in language, is shaped by and irrevocably tied to our bodily experience of the world. The spatial relations of things being up, down, left, right, in front, or behind us are all derived and only make sense in light of our particular human body and its possible human postures. And similarly, metaphorical expressions like acid that eats through metal like butter, or in the heat of the moment, and so on, they all rely on social contexts and human embodiment. And so I think these examples indicate that language is intrinsically connected to our sensory motor system and our uniquely human way of being in the world. So whatever transhumanism will upload, it's not going to be human. And so let me just conclude then with a couple of remarks. So I don't really think, and we can discuss this, probably people have other opinions on this, I don't really think we should lose really a lot of sleep over the actual possibility that the futuristic visions of transhumanism will become reality. For neither is technology as advanced as we are made to believe, nor will whatever we might eventually upload be human. We should rather worry about, I think, the impact of transhumanism on our imagination. And there are two problems here, I think, that arise from the near total ignorance among transhumanists of what constitutes a human being, a human person. And the first is that the transhumanists disregard the enfleshment of human consciousness in a living body. Ray Kurzweil, for example, tends to reduce the mind to the brain and the brain to an information processor, hampered by its biological substrate, we will soon replace, along with our bodies, with non-biological systems. He compares our human identity to the profile stored on a smartphone. Personal identity is, I quote him, preserved through continuity of the pattern of information that makes us us. It never dawns on Kurzweil that he has no trouble turning people into machines because he already considers them to be machines. Kurzweil's transhumanist dream is only possible on the stunted vision of a human person based on the Cartesian dualism that we've been talking about. And then the second problem, and perhaps even the greater problem, is what the technocritic Stephen Talbot has called our self-forgetfulness. Our long-range problem is not that we will actually develop machines with human-like intelligence. I agree completely here with philosophers like Hubert Dreyfus and Robert Spemann that computers or AI neither think nor understand anything because they lack an embodied, self-transcendent human consciousness. Without a living human body, artificial intelligence lacks precisely the knowing one's way around kind of understanding that makes a child more skillful than a computer. Computers don't think and they don't understand. These are best metaphors we can apply to them for what we do. And it is true, I know that artificial intelligence proves successful in isolated sort of micro-worlds, right? I mean, now they can win Jeopardy and they can beat chess players and so on. But as Dreyfus says, they're not good at finding you a life partner, build a family, or serve you as a spiritual guide. No, the real danger is that we actually begin to believe that they can do these things. The real danger is that we reduce ourselves to the computational mechanisms and way of perceiving of machines. The prevalent, largely unquestioned use of technology then in education, communication, law enforcement, business management, and so on, is what discourages truly human personal ways of being and thinking, discourages embodied social engagement, discourages the struggle for wisdom, discourages contact with nature, and leads to the atrophy of physical and mental self-discipline. In short, we risk losing all the kind of habits that cultivate personhood. So technology should obviously assist us, and it's marvelous if it can, in becoming better persons rather than diminish our humanity. And so I'll just end with this, I think it's an apt caution by Dreyfus, who spent much of his life on working on these issues philosophically. He says, man's nature is indeed so malleable that it may be on the point of changing again. If the computer paradigm becomes so strong that people begin to think of themselves as digital devices on the model of work on artificial intelligence, then since for the reasons we have been rehearsing, and we have been rehearsing together, machines cannot be like human beings may become progressively like machines. And so our risk is not the advent of super-intelligent computers, but of sub-intelligent human beings. Thank you very much for your attention.
So I guess I'm wondering what you think about aspects of technology that don't take away from those three categories. So for example, augmented reality, or for example, companies using microchips to clock in and out employees, those kind of issues. with technology that don't verge fully on transhumanism, but have elements that reduce humans to economic or other non-human roles primarily. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. As I said, transhumanism for me is sort of the utopian, I think non-realizable, but imaginary edge that influences a lot of things. So I think we need to adjudicate all these technologies on the basis of are they diminishing of our humanity, no matter what the technology. I mean, this could be very simple technology. We've been with this technology forever and ever. And so if like implants or something like that would, of course, you have to have, on the other hand, sort of a robust sense of what it means to be human in order to gauge whether these things are diminishing our humanity in the first place. So part of the real danger is that we don't see any danger with any of these kind of things. So it all depends context-wise. Like your clocking thing, you sort of implant that clocks when you come in or out or something like that out of a building. That immediately evokes for me as an academic the sort of total transition we've had in our university, where academics have begun to be treated like employees who just come in at 5, or at 8 and should stay at 5 and do a certain number of things. Whereas I grew up with a completely different ethos of what it means to be an academic. So you have a shift in understanding first, and then technology can reinforce that sort of shift. The other part that I want to say to you on this, which I think is really important, is this interesting or ethical problem of, so on the one hand, you want technology to help overcome human disability and pain. I mean, who would not? So if my child had a missing limb or some problem that you could, through brain scanning and supposed manipulation of these kind of things, could fix depression and so on and so forth, of course you'd want to do that. I mean, who would not want to do that? At the same time, there's this, that other people and even handicapped people have said, that suffering, handicaps and so on allow us to develop senses and abilities that we otherwise would never develop. So are you going to say no implants, no prostheses, no anything because, for instance, a blind person, why would you give them eyes again? Because some will claim they have a sense of perceiving the world that is so much richer in some sense, even though they cannot see. I think that's a real dilemma. But it points to the fact that if you simply say everything can be fixed technologically, there are, in terms of spiritual senses or even abilities that we might have of perception, we will never know them, never explore them. It will completely atrophy because we simply have a technological quick fix for everything. Yeah. Ellie.
Thank you very much, Jens, for that. I suppose my question is about your definition of personhood, because I want to agree with you on so many things, and when you reject Singer's ability-based description of personhood, I want to go with that. But then your own definition of personhood in your 3 categories seems to rely on ability in a lot of ways. So, when you say we are linguistic beings, when you say we can know ourselves through the other, so what happens to humans who can't do those things, and how do we discuss personhood for those humans? Yeah.
So this is a really excellent question, and I will try to answer it, but I would recommend to you reading Robert Sperman's book on personhood, because he gets exactly those things, and he has very good answers that I wish I could just sort of give as my own. But what I want to do, and I know these are just 3 elements I took out because I think they're crucial. What I want to say is that nothing, because we are a package, that nothing can be really separated out, but that in the end, of course, we do lose capabilities, and they are capabilities. So, but I don't just want to say that you know, in the end, we are, what is a person? A person is, in the end, only perhaps even an ethically, socially constituted self-awareness. Because then, you know, I think we're all of these things, but what you have to discuss is how when somebody loses certain capabilities, you're stripped of things that are intrinsic to being a person in the fullest sense, but it doesn't mean that you're no longer a person. So, I mean, I want to say that ultimately the person is this being known by another, right, in an ethical, relational sense, which Bonhoeffer comes to as this crucible moment. Like, what am I? I have no clue, but I know that my identity ultimately rests in God. But I don't want that to become a weapon of some fundamentalist Christian kind of thinking that says, well, that's really what we are, and the rest you can just forget, the body, our linguistic capabilities, our relationality in terms of embodied relations and so on, community, I can just be individualistic, being known by God. So that's the difficulty, but yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up? So I think Hans Reinders deals really well with that in his book on friendship.
Okay.
So if that's a resource that you haven't looked at, I think he does it really well.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
The nice thing is we'll have a panel discussion at the end of the day where more questions will be asked. But for now, we'll move on.